Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
When the three of us gathered this morning, we had planned to do a certain topic. But sitting last night watching the news, hearing the reports this morning, each of us came to the session tearful, hurting, confused about the riots and the suffering that's being detailed so poignantly from so many different corners. And we asked ourselves, how can we sit with this in a Jungian lens? It's seductive to want to chime in politically. The three of us were social workers. We have social justice voices ringing in our ears, and all of the intensities that brings. But Jung offers us a lens and suggests that when we can find an archetypal pattern which reasonably seems to be moving through a situation, it allows us to sublimate or rise above the concrete happenings and consider forces and patterns that are transpersonal. And that can give us a perspective and, quite frankly, a little bit of relief and refuge from the tumult and chaos that's happening right in front of us. So today we're going to talk about the riots.
Yeah, and I'm just so aware of how easy it is to get swept up in this and to identify with the voices that are experiencing great pain and outrage. And that's important. And somehow it can also lead to a one-sidedness.
And I think, of course, these things are so distressing, so upsetting. Our affect comes up, first of all, when we see this. All kinds of feelings get stirred up. And then we have to make some kind of closure, some kind of resolution. And then I think we start to land on one square or another, or even several squares, where it's because of this, or this is why these things happen, or who's right, who's wrong, as a way of wrapping ourselves around it, making meaning of something that is so distressing that we attempt to contain it, often in kind of scripts or storylines that are way too small for the human events that are happening.
You know, if I may, I want to read a quote from Jung and then offer something about this. So he says, when the separation is carried so far that the complementary opposite is lost sight of, and the blackness of the whiteness, the evil of the good, the depth of the heights, and so on, is no longer seen, the result is one-sidedness, which is then compensated from the unconscious without our help. The counterbalancing is even done against our will, which in consequence must become more and more fanatical until it brings about a catastrophic enantiodromia. Wisdom never forgets that all things have two sides, and it would also know how to avoid such calamities if ever it had any power. But power is never found in the seat of wisdom. It is always the focus of mass interests and is therefore inevitably associated with the illimitable folly of the mass man. And I want to just pick up on that and weave it into what you started with, Joseph, talking about a sublimatio, kind of rising above, because I think when I read that quote, I think about, what good leadership does at a moment like this is try to find the both and, kind of rise above the one-sidedness. And I'm thinking about, for me, that's been the mayor of Atlanta in the past few days over this weekend. Like, she's just made some remarkable statements calling on people to kind of unite in a constructive way to press for change, but really trying to calm the destructiveness. And I think that's what leadership can do in a moment like this, is find the sublimatio.
It's a lovely image. And, I think of it very concretely because I've seen an image of this in one of Edward Edinger's books of the view of Cape Cod from above. And that's really it, of seeing something whole and seeing it somewhat more objectively and using that archetypal lens. Then we have something we can relate to. Rather than being right down in it emotionally as kind of virtual participants caught up in it. And it's a both and. It's not as if one or the other is the way to go. But if we can also see it from above, as if looking down on something, and find that uniting arc, as the mayor of Atlanta seems to have been able to do.
So if we lift up and explore a couple of archetypal frames, and I want to tell the listeners that we are hypothesizing from whatever stance we can find around this. I don't think any of us are talking from certainty around it. One thing that we can say is that all archetypal systems have a frame of creating, sustaining, and dissolving or creating chaos. That there is also a pattern of dissolution and chaos, which is part of a larger natural order. Our Buddhist friends, my friends who practice Vipassana, for instance, will often sit for many hours in a deep contemplation. And in that process, very intense feelings and memories will rise up, which they are expected to contain. And as they contain them, they're advised to remind themselves that everything in my life rises, everything in my life sustains, and everything will dissolve into a chaos. And to create a frame of normalcy for that process, it allows them to enter into a non-reactive and observing stance and a state of acceptance of that cycle of natural suffering and occasional joy. That's one way of philosophizing and holding, I think.
Yeah, that's a really great frame. That's a really great frame to normalize it, to make room for it. And I think there is a process of dissolution or chaos going on now, isn't there?
As there is always, but often in smaller ways. Friendships are created, sustained, they dissolve. Our expectations for our families are created, they're sustained, and all of a sudden your children are graduating from high school, and the family is in essence dissolving and waiting to see what the new configuration will be. And in a larger sense, our loved ones also dissolve into death at the end of their lives, and we are left with heartache and the stress and tension of change that we cannot control, but have to find a frame of acceptance around it.
And I think you're pointing to something so important of the sense of our sorrow and our heartbreak and a helplessness to change things, to change human suffering, whether it's a child departing from home or a loved one who may have been sick or died during this pandemic. And that somehow it may be a lot easier to be mad than sad. And I wonder often, because I think we've all experienced it, how often we would rather be mad because it's activating, it's empowering, it's falsely empowering. But at least we can give action and attempt to release or vent some of the feelings that we're not able to contain, like your Buddhist practitioner friend.
So we're talking, I think, in the realm of tension and discharge of tension. Depending on how much stress any one human being is under, their ability to hold tension and discharge it creatively ebbs and flows. So if we're under a lot of duress, we've been sitting at home for 3 months without a paycheck. So people in our community are very, very sick, or loved ones have passed away with this current pandemic, and all number of other uncertainties which we deal with every day despite the lens of this pandemic. We're holding an enormous amount of tension. For many of us, that can lead to a regression.
Mm-hmm.
And what Jung meant by that is our life force within our own individual psyches begins to slide away from our most sophisticated versions of ourselves down a kind of hillside inside of us, and it begins to pool into much younger, more primal and instinctive parts of ourselves. And when our life force begins to flow away from our more refined self, it is much more likely to discharge in more primal ways.
Especially when we're dealing with masses. I mean, Jung was very, very distrustful of masses. I mean, this is one of the places where he gets a little one-sided, I think, because he rarely speaks of the benefits of a kind of collective psychology. He really mistrusted it, and part of that is probably because he was so introverted, but part of it is because he saw the incredible destructiveness that's possible. I mean, his life spanned World War I and World War II. Joseph, I think you described that so beautifully, that process of regression and how it kind of activates more primal features of us. I also want to say that when we're in that tension, as so many have been sitting in, and, there's just unthinkable levels of unemployment in the United States right now. And I think we can't underestimate the suffering that's involved with that. We also can tend to project. That can be one of the more primitive ways of dealing with our psychological tension. It's normal, but there is a danger to it. And apropos of that, I'm hoping we can sit with this idea about projection and one-sidedness a bit, because I think there's a lot to say here that's going on in these riots, that this is an active piece of it. And I want to sort of start off with this quote. Today, humanity, this is from Collected Works 9.2. Today, humanity, as never before, is split into two apparently irreconcilable halves. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. That is to say, when the individual remains undivided and does not become conscious of his inner opposite, the world must perforce act out the conflict and be torn into opposing halves. That just seems to me just so incredibly accurate about what's happening. And it also suggests a remedy that in some sense we've all got to do the personal work of finding both of those parts within us. We have to reconcile, or at least confront, the inner opposite so that we don't project it and see it as bad people out there.
That is such an apropos quote. And I think we can see in a situation like rioting how dangerous it can be when one-sidedness takes hold and when projection on another as the all bad takes over and can lead into the kind of berserker one-sidedness, that kind of frenzy, a kind of possession by, the archetypal forces of chaos and destruction. And that there is one-sidedness at its extreme and infused with a kind of archetypal energy, which is what I think crowds are well known to be especially susceptible to.
Yes, crowds are well known to be susceptible to psychic epidemics.
And by that we mean when a large mass of people come together and they're under a lot of intensities, they're more likely to descend down into a collective level and participate in this primal personage, the one primal human being whose reactions are very instinctive, do not have a lot of thought necessarily, and are predominantly reactive rather than creative. And when we see people reacting from that level, it has a kind of seductive draw to us. For instance, in certain environments, we might even take a much less provocative example of a sports stadium. This several years ago, we may remember these soccer game riots that were happening. Everybody knows it's a game. Everybody knows that what the rules of good sportsmanship are. But sometimes, with the tension of a team winning or losing, all of a sudden the intensity in the stand among the fans can get so high that a single person turning around and punching somebody can then set off a wave of people punching or ripping up seats or tossing people around. You can actually see it in some of the videos, like a wave or a ripple. So sometimes when we begin to see one person breaking and acting in that way, it seems to give a collective permission sometimes to act in that way.
Yeah, affect is just so contagious. And to amplify that a little bit more, Deb, you had mentioned the berserkers a minute ago, and maybe I'll just pick up on that. The berserkers were these bear warriors of the Vikings, and they would go into states of absolute frenzy during battle. It was believed at the time that they actually shape-shifted, they actually became bears, and that when they were in their frenzy, they were immune to steel, I think, or something like that. And they would howl and foam at the mouth and gnaw the iron rim of their shields. And they just created a lot of havoc and created a lot of fear. They were very successful in war because, their enemies were just terrified of them. But I think that kind of frenzy is something that we're all susceptible to in crowds. Like, we all have it in us to get absolutely swept away or possessed. And I think some of what we're seeing in the riots, we can understand that way.
For me, I think that it's our feelings that really make us human, that we do relate and we connect and we can be infected and all kinds of things by our feelings. And along with that comes this other much more unappealing task of having to be able to know what we're feeling and name it, and then have the sublimatio that Joseph mentioned at the beginning to rise above it and have sort of a self-observational thing, like looking down at ourselves from the skybox. And that is a tough task versus the feeling state that you're imaging so vividly of these bear warriors that, can gnaw their metal shields and work themselves up into a possessed state where consciousness has a very little role in what is going on, and the warrior archetype just infuses them.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if I may, you just said something that really sparked something for me, which is consciousness has very little role in what's going on. And certainly we can see that in some of the footage that we're seeing. It's, who's doing what to whom for what purpose. And while I so resonate with the moral outrage that the protesters are feeling, the acts of violence, when I see the footage of it, it's like, what is the remedy being sought?
Telos.
What is the telos? Thank you, Joseph.
The forward movement.
Right? What's trying to emerge, even if it's in a heartbreaking, even tortured way. If we imagined this was a person, and inside a person, maybe in midlife even, there's an internal riot, that there's an internal system that's out of balance, that there's too much on one side, there are internal injustices or devaluations of other parts of the soul, and then a kind of storm rises up inside of the psyche, which demands a breaking down of the old personality in order to make room for a larger principle to take hold, so that the personality can blossom, not in a totally utopian way, but blossom at least several steps forward of what it used to be. And that does require a melting down of old systems, which could be done elegantly, consciously. And if it's not done elegantly, then something in the psyche will mount an insurrection.
I'm back on that word reactive versus what I think might be a better word and a better response, which is responsive. Of how do we respond, which to me means with consciousness and feeling, but really from a choiceful place rather than a reactive place, whether it's a person or a collective. So I like your example as a person of a midlife crisis. Where is a real response that can be elegant and it can be painful at the same time versus just a reaction? Like some of those tropes in films and stories about, the guy at midlife that just buys a motorcycle and drives across the country for 3 years. Which we might say is a reaction. And how do we understand ourselves in all of this, rather than just moving to what's out there, as if out there is the only reality?
Comes back to this idea of needing a symbol. And right now, if the United States were a singular psyche holding unbearable tensions and of all different kinds, in order for there to be a breaking down and a reorganization on a higher level, there needs to be a symbol to gather those forces together on a higher arc. And maybe there are people who are having dreams on behalf of the collective, which are offering these symbols. Maybe not, but it's required. We're waiting for the new image to emerge where people can rally and bring their energy to the building of the new image. And the way the new world has been imagined thus far doesn't seem to be adequate.
And Joseph, your thought about a symbol that would unite the opposites. We are really in need of that, because now I think one of the things that's characteristic of this is how split we are. That there are the good guys and the bad guys, and we're all wanting to stand on one side and decry the people standing on the other side as evil. And I'm going to go back to my quote bank here. This is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And there's something about this cultural moment, I think, that is just inviting us to deny the evil within ourselves and project it onto the other. We need the transcendent function to help lift us out of that terrible one-sidedness, because it breeds destruction.
One of the images that I think tries to soften the splitting and is already emerging and has emerged at other times when these conflicts have sparked intensely in the last several years is the image occasionally of one of the police officers hugging one of the protesters. That seems to be one level of medicine that the collective will generate.
Mm-hmm.
And often those images will become virally intense across the internet.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of images of the past couple days. We should say that we're recording on Monday, June 1st, by the way, but over the weekend of police officers joining the protesters, or, bending on one knee to signal their solidarity.
Reading lists of the names of other victims
Mm-hmm.
that have died in police violence. And those are symbols of coming together around the pain of what's happening, even though there is not a solution.
Yes.
I wonder in a way if that is the symbol of heartbreak. Can we let our hearts break over this? And then that would allow us to reach across to what we had perceived as the other side,
Mm-hmm.
and realize that we are all human. We lead complicated lives, that there is injustice, that there is suffering, but that we can share the pain of that suffering, no matter who you are or which side of some proverbial fence you seem to be on, and be in sorrow about it. The police officers reading lists of people who have died is a great example of that, of moving right into the heartbreak.
And the image of the embrace.
Yes.
The embrace in the midst of the frenzy of pain and violence. There's a Celtic mythic hero, Cuchulainn, who was a kind of King David image for that culture, the perfect warrior who saved various Celtic cultures time and again from their enemies. And in one telling, Cuchulainn is so possessed by the power to make war, by the power to defeat the others, that he has in fact vanquished an opposing army, but still this tornado of war making is in him, and he starts to turn on friends and his own side, this kind of friendly fire frenzy. And out of desperation, the leaders come together seeking wisdom. And finally, they send the young and beautiful daughter of one of the leaders into Cuchulainn's frenzy to gently approach him and eventually embrace him. And it's in the embrace that the wild frenzy that we are all capable of is finally calmed. I see the embrace of police officers and protesters. I see the embrace between protesters. I think the image of the mutual embrace is at least one symbolic image that is medicinal if it could take hold adequately.
Yeah, and as you pointed out earlier, Joseph, before we started recording, that the Cuchulainn story, the meeting with the beautiful young woman, that's the meeting with soul. That's the restorative encounter with the anima. So it does take a reconnection with our self and our soul to becalm the frenzy.
And that's the connected place, the soul and the embrace and the calming, the Eros, the love. Some of those images that you've referred to may be our transcendent function here, that we can come to an embrace, come to a calming, come to a recognition of our common humanity. I think I'm aware that the three of us this morning are really in that place of trying to talk about this from a place that can feel our feelings and not get caught up in the politics of it or racial tensions or anything else. I'm aware of how hard it is to talk about this. It is full of feeling.
I was struck as I was driving to the office today, listening to the New York Times podcast, The Daily. Today's podcast is called A Weekend of Pain and Protest on their website. And they had captured an audio file of an older African-American man reaching out to one of the younger men who was caught up in a frenzy of rage, trying desperately to reach him and to connect with him and to tell him that this violence is not the way. And as he's speaking to the young fellow, you can hear the tears and the sobbing in his voice over the heartbreak of what is happening, the suffering of what has happened, the helplessness around all of it. It was so striking at the level of soul that I arrived at the office just crying, tears running down my face with the humanity of all of the struggle that we're in, and still carrying that as we started our recording today.
I think that might be another image for what the sublimatio, the symbol, is our tears. I'm aware that in so many fairy tales and biblical stories and other sources, it's our tears that bring the angel or the appearance of something new, that our tears are the force for change in our hearts.
So we're talking about all of this feeling and all of this sorrow, and I think just resonating with the terrible injustices that have given rise to this and the destructiveness of the riots, and just curious about the archetypal frame that we're in. And what gods are in the ascendance right now? How can we understand this from an archetypal perspective?
Well, what comes up for me is that we've just been talking about the appearance of soul and embrace and heartbreak, and that maybe on the other side, the god here is Eris, Eris, the goddess of discord, the goddess who likes to create strife and trouble. And that maybe archetypally, that's the battle that's going on between the forces of a kind of connected relatedness and the forces that want to promote divisiveness and disharmony.
So Eros was the goddess of discord, as you said, Deb, and her Roman name was Discordia, which is pretty great if you ask me. And she's most famous for initiating the Trojan War by causing the judgment of Paris. There apparently was a wedding that she wasn't invited to, and she felt a little salty about that. So she threw a golden apple, called the apple of discord, into the party, and it was inscribed, for the most beautiful one. And so the goddesses all started quarreling about who deserved the apple. And Paris, the Prince of Troy, was appointed to select the fairest by Zeus. So they all started vying. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite all started vying to win the apple and promising him different things. Athena promised him political power, and Athena promised him infinite wisdom. And Aphrodite said that he could have the most beautiful woman in the world. And that would be Helen, the wife of Menelaus of Sparta, who unfortunately was already married. But Paris chose to award the apple to Aphrodite, and that started the Trojan War, which was, of course, hugely, hugely destructive.
And went on for a long time, 10 years. So the two archetypal forces here is her sister was Harmonia, right? We have Discordia and Harmonia. And which do we choose? Really, which do we choose? Whether it's with a neighbor, a family member, a colleague, or in our national collective and discourse.
And what I find your question stirring in me, Deb, is how can we bring ourselves to a place of choice that these archetypal patterns where the apple of discordia is tossed in the room and even the goddesses are compelled to succumb to the power of discordia. How does an average person resist the archetypal apple of discord? What do we find to stand against that? And as we said earlier, consciousness, and having done the work of greater consciousness, gives us a kind of inoculation, perhaps.
Jung certainly believed it did.
Knowing something about archetypal forces to be able to question ourselves that if I am feeling impulses or acting in a way which is deeply different from what I think is normal for me or reasonable, can also spark a question of what am I under, what shadow am I caught under?
Certainly, Jung was a great proponent of consciousness. And I'm thinking, how do we do that? You've posed such a good question, Joseph, of, okay, so then what do I do when something really lights my fire? I think one step that's possible is to engage the thinking or consciousness function and say, what is the name of this feeling? I am feeling something right now, and it is called, and fill in the blank. And another place I think we can go that will speak to us is our hearts. Wait a minute, where's my heart right now? And if we can summon up some feeling of a common humanity, that even though I'm very angry with my neighbor, he is also my neighbor. And there's a both and there of I can have my feeling and I can have a connection in myself with other feelings too, so that it's not just one feeling in the moment.
Yeah. And again, that requires being able to do what you're talking about, Deb, really requires being able to hold a psychological attitude. You know, Jung said anything that disappears from your psychological inventory, so anything that you deny in yourself, is apt to turn up in the guise of a hostile neighbor who will inevitably arouse your anger and make you aggressive. It is surely better to know that your worst enemy is right there in your own heart.
That was just the perfect quote to come right up right then.
But you know, I'm going to make this even a little more difficult in a way, I think, because Jung says this incredibly, such a kind of accurate but difficult thing about being swept up in a mass movement and the way that it can invite us to cede our personal authority. So some of the answer here is also about recognizing our own responsibility in the situation. And again, I feel like all I'm doing today is reading quotes, but I have so many good ones. But I want to read this one. It's a little bit longer. This is Jung. He says, all mass movements, as one might expect, slip with the greatest ease down an inclined plane made up of large numbers. Where the many are, there is security. What the many believe must, of course, be true. What the many want must be worth striving for and necessary and therefore good. In the clamor of the many resides the power to snatch wish fulfillments by force. Sweetest of all, however, is that gentle and painless slipping back into the kingdom of childhood, into the paradise of parental care, into happy-go-luckiness and irresponsibility. All the thinking and looking after are done from the top. To all questions there is an answer, and for all needs the necessary provision is made. The infantile dream state of the mass man is so unrealistic that he never thinks to ask who is paying for this paradise. The balancing of accounts is left to a higher political or social authority, which welcomes the task, for its power is thereby increased, and the more power it has, the weaker and more helpless the individual becomes. So there's so much in there, but some of it is part of what's up for me in that is the way that we can, when we're swept up in a mass movement like a riot, we aren't suffering the sort of authentic kind of problem. In a way, we're in a little bit of that neurotic suffering place because we think there's an answer. We think there's an answer and that someone else can provide it. And I think kind of going back to what you were talking about earlier, Deb, about feeling, some of it is just about suffering the feeling and the sadness and the horror, and getting swept up in a mob that is filled with berserker energy gets us away from that feeling that you were talking about earlier, Joseph.
We are more vulnerable than we like to admit. Vulnerable to our own unconscious forces, vulnerable to enormous, powerful, oceanic waves of feeling to be carried down the streets, to be carried into actions which feel alien to us in retrospect. I also want to say there is nothing new about this.
No,
and that's why it's archetypal.
That's why it's archetypal.
Some of you may know that early in my life, I was a mediocre actor. So, but I did get a Bachelor of Fine Arts in acting, so I think of myself as a thespian. And my inner thespian suddenly was remembering Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. This was written in the late 1500s, and Julius Caesar has just been assassinated. He has been killed, like George Floyd was killed. And Anthony is alone with Julius Caesar's body. Right after the assassination, he's holding this injured friend in his mind, and he begins to reveal his intention to incite the crowd at Caesar's funeral to rise up and riot. He says, "Oh, pardon me, thou bleeding piece of earth, that I am meek and gentle with these butchers. Thou art the ruins of noblest men that ever lived in the tide of times. Woe to the hand that shed this costly blood. Over thy wounds now do I prophesy, which like dumb mouths do open their ruby lips to beg the voice and utterance of my tongue. Curse shall light upon the limbs of men. Domestic fury and fierce civil strife shall cumber all parts of Italy. Blood and destruction shall be so in use, and dreadful objects so familiar, that mothers shall but smite when they behold their infants quartered with the hands of war. All pity, choked with custom of fell deeds. and Caesar's spirit, raging for revenge. With 8 by his side, come hot from hell, shall in these confines with a monarch's voice cry havoc, and let slip the dogs of war, that this foul deed shall smell above the earth with carrion men groaning for burial.
Wow.
Bravo.
We are in this moment.
Yeah, we're in this moment. Yep.
And crying for the dogs of war.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's nothing new under the sun about what's happening. And in these hundreds and even thousands of years, as human beings, we have not learned even yet a different response to these injustices.
And maybe that's the place to stop for today and switch to a dream.
Hi, this is Joseph from This Jungian Life podcast. Lisa, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us with as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
This is a woman who's 50. She's an artist. And here's the dream. I was in a forest next to a fortress wall. A little boy appeared with a cotton hood over his head that covered his face. The child was riding a white pony. I could see his blue eyes through slits in the hood. They looked sideways. I don't know if the child saw me, but he felt I was there because he clung to me. I hugged him and the pony with great love and tenderness. The child needed my love and protection. At that moment, a man in green clothes and armor approached me. Without being aggressive, he told me that I had to leave the child, who was the king's son and had his own guard. The man kindly invited me to go with him. I was divided in my feelings. I felt great love for the child, but I also felt guilt that I was breaking some high rules I didn't understand. I followed the man, who was now dressed in a long red robe and looked like a royal nobleman. I was walking about 10 meters after him. We went around the fortress and took the streets of the city. We walked for a long time. He entered a building. I followed him at a distance. When I entered the building, I heard his voice from below. He was walking down the stone stairs. He told me to pass him a big black hook on a chain. I obeyed unquestioningly and handed him the hook. At that moment, for the first time, I doubted the man and his intentions. Horrified, I realized that guided by my guilt, I was following a torturer who made his prey prepare their own torments. I realized that I had to do something right away, and I regretted that I had not felt the threat before when I could easily escape, because moving away after him, we were often in different places. For example, he had already entered the entrance, and I was still walking down the street. All I had to do was rush back up the stairs before entering his dungeon. I woke up in horror. And for context, the dreamer supplies the information that she had the dream in a moment of great professional success, which brought her new and unexpected opportunities. But instead of enjoying these gifts, she fell into a severe, deep black depression. And her feelings in the dream, she reports, were horror, and curiosity about the severe man I've known from other dreams, and the real shock of the fact that I'm the one who cooperates with this abuser. Well, this dream is really almost a short story, isn't it?
I'm feeling really moved by it.
In the context, the dreamer demonstrates that she's done a lot of work on herself, that she is rather quickly able to hold the idea that this dream and all of the tensions in it are all part of her.
And she does say in some further context that she's had this kind of figure in many dreams before. She says that he's an old acquaintance and he appears in many of her dreams playing different roles, and that she feels connected with him in some way. So I think you're right, Joseph. I think she's done a lot of work. I mean, obviously, this brings up for me the fairy tale of Bluebeard, which, Clarissa Pinkola Estes talks about that fairy tale in Women Who Run with the Wolves. And she talks about it as Bluebeard is an example of the inner predator. I forget if that's exactly the term she uses, but that's the idea. And, that we all have one. We all have an inner predator. And here he is. The dreamer can see very clearly that she's colluding with him. This also strikes me as just kind of a perfect illustration of Don Kalshed's self-care system. So Don Kalshed's book, The Inner World of Trauma, he talks about the Persecutor Protector, a figure that behaves particularly in the psyche of those who've experienced trauma in childhood, whose function is to protect the personality from further harm by keeping the personality from making connections that happened. In the original trauma, it happened because the person was vulnerable, because she or he let himself be connected to another. So in later life, when some opening or vulnerability or connection's about to happen, the persecutor protector rises up, often outpictured in dreams in a violent way as a predator or persecutor, to cut off that new connection. And so it would make perfect sense that this dream would come up at a time of success and expanding vistas, because that's, to a traumatized psyche, that indicates danger.
And I think we see it right here in the dream, in the situation at the outset of the dream of this boy appears with a cotton hood over his head that covered his face. So here's this young child on a white pony, and she moves toward this boy who clings to her, and she embraces the pony and the boy with great love and tenderness. The child needs my love and protection. And then, boom, the inner predator appears. As soon as that love, the tenderness, and the embrace for the inner vulnerable part of her, imaged as a boy, a child, appears, comes the cut-off predator who says, "Oh, no, you don't.
Come with me.
Come with me." And in her waking life, she just has had a great success, and that too has been cut off. She went into a severe depression instead of being able to embrace it.
I think this tension between innocence and the protection or injury of innocence is definitely a theme in the psyche. I'd also like to offer an amplification. The Green Knight is a well-established figure in the Arthurian legends and seems to be occurring here. Like a lot of medieval stories, there are different accountings of it. Sometimes the Green Knight is a faithful servant of the good King Arthur and becomes an extension of that. But in one of the more popular tellings, a spell is put upon him by Morgan Le Fay, Arthur's pagan adversary, and turns him into a murderous adversary of Arthur. And in some pictures, he's shown walking around with a severed head in his hand. Now, he's an ambivalent figure because the tension in the medieval story is between the Christian missionary attempts of the early Catholic Church to evangelize Christianity and to oppress the indigenous paganism. And Morgan Le Fay and the Green Knight are the champions of the ancient world and are trying to fight for its legitimacy. And they are in a war. In that way, I think I can step back and also see the dream as a collision of principles. That the Green Knight can also be something more ancient in her psyche and is challenging some of the excessive colonization in the psyche of rules and religious values and cultural mores that could also be strangling her. For instance, in one of the contexts later in the dream, she's curious to understand why, right at the moment of a great professional success, which was very, very positive for her, she fell into a severe, deep, black depression. It is possible that these things that the outer world considers a great success is at odds with something that is more instinctive, primal, and green in herself, that wants to fight for space in the psyche as well, and that war involves kind of violent feelings that are frightening to the better known parts of her personality.
Just to kind of piggyback on this idea that this is ambivalent, Joseph, one of the important things about Kalshed's formulation is to understand that the inner persecutor is doing it to protect us. So to see that very dark energy in the psyche as ultimately having a positive telos is part of meeting it. So I think that is an important question to ask is, what are the gifts that this figure brings?
So this dream really embodies some of what we were talking about earlier in the podcast of holding the tension. It's very easy to say, oh, this character in the Green Man is a torturer and all bad, versus it's much more ambiguous than that. It's not an either or. And how might the dreamer, in her own reflections, have maybe an imaginal encounter with this Green Man of, who are you? Why do you keep showing up in my dreams? What do you want from me? What do you want to tell me or teach me? Which is not acceding to this, which is what happens in the dream. She wants to run away, and it's not surrendering her own authority, but it is daring to have an encounter.
Along those lines, the dreamer might have to suspend the dream ego's opinion about the Green Knight, that the Green Knight demonstrates this hook, and the dream ego assumes at that moment this is dark and terrible, and he's a torturer, and she's been compliant with a torturer. But the dream does not confirm that. We do not have an image of the Green Knight torturing anybody or threatening them. The dream ego is entering into a state of fear. For instance, if the Green Knight is simply connected to very instinctive, primal, green, forest-like forces in her, she could find that very amoral, the way the forest is amoral, and therefore very, very frightening. But we don't know what the Green Knight is going to do quite yet. So Deb's suggestion of plucking up some courage to encounter the Green Knight in a deeply relaxed state so that we're not manipulating the image, we could find out that the Green Knight is more sophisticated or more dimensional than the dream ego might have imagined at the moment that it was encountered.
And one image that I'm thinking might be, at least it's intriguing to me, is the image of this man walking down the stone stairs. Often this kind of descent really is an image of descending deeper into one's own unconscious and psyche.
Yeah, or a depression.
But Jung had a dream that's very well known about descending down through layers and layers and layers until he finally got to the sub-basement. I'm curious as to what is this descent? Going down to what she believes is going to be something hellacious.
Well, my feeling is it probably will be, or it probably was, but it might be necessary.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.